right, good morning. How are we doing this morning? Man, what an amazing time of worship we had. Anybody thankful for the team that was up here? Yeah, my good friend Adam Richards, who's the worship pastor at Stonewater Church in Granbury, amazing leader, and he graced us with his presence today, and I'm so thankful to Adam. But I don't know how you're ever going to listen to me sing again, because Adam's got some pipes, right? If you don't know me, my name's David Fish. I oversee the worship department here, and I'm also a teaching pastor on staff here. And if you weren't here last week, I said every October-ish, Pastor Joey, our lead pastor, takes a couple weeks just to write and dream and reflect and pray and get before the Lord and seek fresh vision for the coming year. We have the most hardworking pastor I've ever met. Yeah, you can cheer for that. Day in and day out, loves the staff, loves the church, and pours in day in and day out. So you're going to be stuck with me for a couple more weeks, and we're in a sermon series called Deeper. And this series, basically, we covered kind of a 30,000 foot view last week of what does it look like to actually get beyond the surface of just kind of coming to church and doing surface level religious exercises week in and week out. How do we kind of pierce beyond that and actually get into the deeper things that God has for us in his word? And so we went through Hebrews 5 and we just talked about 4 keys of what it looks like to step into spiritual maturity. And if you haven't listened to it, I encourage you to go back because I think it's kind of the foundation for everything that we're going to cover. Because this week we're going to talk about the presence of God, what it means to be a community of presence people. Next week we're talking about what does it look like to be a church defined by worship. The week after that we're going to talk about a church being empowered by the Holy Spirit. And then the last week, we're going to talk about spiritual warfare. And so we have all of these kind of topics that are getting beyond just surface level, stuff that you would hear day in and day out. We're actually going to go a little bit deeper. And I really feel like week 1 sets the tone. Good? All right, if you have a Bible, turn to Exodus chapter 33. Exodus chapter 33. If you're new to the Bible, it's the second book, right after Genesis. About 5 or 6 years ago, I think it was 2015, my dad and I went to the TCU Baylor game. I don't know where your allegiances lie. We'll get there in a second. But my dad was a Baylor grad, but he was not like a fanatical, indoctrinate your children kind of graduate from college, right? I'm looking at you, Alabama fans, Texas fans, right? OU fans. Nah, just kidding. OU doesn't have any fans. Sorry, I'm already getting in trouble. My dad, but basically the extent of our indoctrination was my dad taught us the good old Baylor line song. That good old Baylor line. I won't sing the whole thing for you. But that was basically as much. So, we weren't huge like into college football, but we decided we're going to go see a game, right? And there's nothing, atypical about a father and son catching a game on a weekend. What was atypical about this day was that it was 37 degrees and pouring freezing rain. And listen, we got to the game, it's 37 degrees, pouring freezing rain, and the game was delayed by an hour because of a lightning strike. And as I look back in time, God was like sending a sign from heaven saying, go home, go get in front of the fire, it's not worth it. We did it anyways. 1 hour in, couldn't feel my feet. 2 hours in, you ever been where you cannot feel any part of your face? And of course, listen to me, the game where it's 37 degrees and pouring freezing rain, it went to 7 overtimes. 7 overtimes, and we're just staring there. And of course, I'm from Texas, which means the heaviest winter gear I have is like 2 sweatshirts and a shirt underneath. It's like I don't even know what kind of shoes I had on. They didn't work, I can tell you that. And so we're just we're just freezing. And listen, I know that there's, right now, this area is blowing up a lot, and there's some of you that have moved from up north, all right, and you like to make fun of us, because one snow flurry hits the ground and we start crashing into each other, and we're not really prepared for winter weather. But in our defense, some of you guys, it gets above 85 degrees and you think you're having a heat stroke, okay? So can we all just admit that we all have weather-related issues, all right? Like let's take it easy on each other. We all have our weather-related issues. But there was a moment when we got back home after the hell that we had just endured. And I think you know the moment, right, where you open up the door and that sweet warm air just begins to wash over you. And my dad and I just sat down in the miracle of central heating, and we just said, oh, it's so good to be home. It's so good to be home. Anybody ever had that moment where it's so good to be home? Maybe if you've traveled a lot, I used to travel a lot internationally, and you've been in a strange land with strange food that does strange things to your stomach, and you get back home and you land at the airport and you walk out and you see your family and friends smiling with a bag of Chick-fil-A, and you're just like, it's so good to be home, right? Or for me, it's when I get home, if I've been traveling or gone, and I open up the door and there's some kind of strange aroma, and I kind of crinkle my nose and yell back like, babe, what is that? She's like, I'm diffusing a new oil, you know? It's like, this is bravery oil. It's like, I don't feel any braver, but I'm just kidding. Some of them work, some of them don't. But anyway, either way, when I smell that, I just say, man, it's so good to be home, right? There's things that just, they awaken that thing in view of like, man, this is home. It's so good to be home. And today, the title of today's message is A Community of Presence People. A community of presence people. And we're gonna explain what that means. This is one of our core values as a church. So our vision statement is life-changing encounters in the presence of God. That's what we believe. That's why we believe we come to church. Life-changing encounters in the presence of God. So what does that mean? What does that look like? I think it looks like the fact that when we come to church and we begin to worship Jesus and we come together, the presence of God fills this place, we encounter him, and that's the moment where as a church community we say, it's so good to be home. It's so good to be home. That's where we find our home. And so what does it mean to be presence people? I'm gonna give away my thesis right from the beginning. I'm just gonna hand it to you on a silver platter, and it's this. Presence people are people who find their joy, their identity, and their rest in God's presence. Presence people are people who find their joy, their identity, and their rest in God's presence. That's our vision. Life-changing encounters in the presence of God. We are people defined by the presence of God. But before we ever get going, I've been doing this for 3 years, and I'll probably do it every time I teach on this. We have to understand what we're talking about. Like, maybe you're new to church. Maybe you didn't grow up in church. You didn't grow up hearing like Christianese terms. And listen, Christian is a whole other language, you know? Like if you've never been to church, you walk in, they're like, hey brother, you've been washed by the blood? Like, I am not a serial killer, so no. Like if you don't get the language, it's like, it's a little spooky, right? And so, but even if you did grow up in church or you do have kind of a background, sometimes we can still have these vague terms floating in the back of our mind, and we don't really ever define them clearly enough to get the most out of what Scripture has to say. And so I want to define what the presence of God is. And within the Bible, there's two categories of the presence of God. Okay, there's two categories. The first is the omnipresence of God. Now, I think probably everybody in the room is vaguely at least familiar with the omnipresence of God. The God that we worship is everywhere. He is in all places, at all times, 100% of the time. He's not partially present, he's fully present. In fact, in Psalm 139, David writes this crazy psalm where he tells God, God, I can't even run away from your presence. If I run all the way down to the grave, you're there. If I run all the way up to the heights of heaven, you're still there. Like I can't get away from you. He's saying your presence is everywhere, right? And scientists actually tell us that the universe is slowly expanding. I think this is so cool. It's like God's spoken into being, and God's word is so powerful that it keeps creating universes. Like, isn't that amazing? I think that's incredible. But every single time the universe expands and expands, God's presence is there the moment it expands. Like, just get that image in your mind about the bigness, the vastness of God. Like, that's amazing. He's omnipresent. It doesn't matter if you know he's there or not. It doesn't matter if you're an atheist, a Buddhist, or you worship the Beatles. Like, I don't know. But like, God is everywhere, okay? That's the omnipresence of God. I love the way Tozer says it. He says, omnipresence means simply that God is here. Wherever we are, God is here. There is no place, there can be no place where he is not. That's the omnipresence of God. But there's another category of the presence of God that we see in the Bible, and it's the manifest presence of God. The manifest presence of God. Now, this term is not found in the Bible, but it explains a phenomenon that we see throughout the pages of Scripture. And that's where, despite our best theological language, it might seem kind of clunky, something in you just goes, man, God just showed up. Like, I know he's here all the time, but like this morning when you were in worship, did you not feel like we hit some moments where God just like showed up? It's like something shifted, something changed. I don't care how theological you are in the way you think or how much experience you have with Christianity. I think anybody can sense when the people of God come together and we begin to exalt Jesus, it's like something in the room changes. It's like the air thickens. It's like something happened. And the only way we know to describe it is like God came in the room, God showed up. And in our minds we go, but he's present all the time. So how does that work? Well, the manifest presence of God is when God reveals his presence. Like you can be unaware, but there are times when like it's undeniable. It's like God is in the room. And typically it happens when the people of God gather together in hunger, in worship, in obedience, and we lift up Jesus, and it's like, God's like, here I am. Here I am. Like nobody's gonna be able to deny it. I'm right here. That's the manifest presence of God. And I've used this analogy many times, but I don't have a better one, so I'm gonna use it again. Think about fog, okay? So there's always water. There's always H2O in the air that you breathe. It's in the atmosphere. Everybody good? Elementary science class, right? There are certain chemical compounds that make up our atmosphere. One of them is H2O. So whether you see it or not, every day, everywhere you go, there's water in the atmosphere. But sometimes, when the conditions are just right, you step out your door and it's like this thick layer of fog. So what happened was the water that was already in the air, the water that was invisible, just sitting in the air, for some reason, in a moment of time, became visible. It wasn't like the water wasn't there. It wasn't like the water had to come from some other alternate reality. The water was always in the air. But when the conditions were right, the water became visible. The water became manifest, and it's fog. That's the idea of the manifest presence of God, that sometimes we're in the midst of worship. It's not just, oh, vaguely I know God's here somewhere. It's like, no. The presence of God is in the room. He's revealing himself. We can encounter him. We can touch him, taste him, smell him. It's like he's right there. That's the manifest presence of God. And Jesus defined this actually as where 2 or 3 are gathered. You remember that? He said, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am in the midst of them. Now, why would he say that? He's everywhere. Why would he qualify where 2 or 3 are gathered? Because something special happens when the people of God gather in the presence of God. Okay? That's the manifest presence of God. And here's the thing. When you boil it all down, here's my argument to you this morning. The story of the Bible is the story of God's presence. The story of the Bible, from start to finish, is all about God's presence. Now, you might say, I thought it was all about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a big part, but why did God forgive you? God forgave you so you could be in his presence. Have you ever thought about that? Do you know that God could have forgiven you and made you a servant waiting tables for all of eternity? Like, we have no right to say, oh, I have to be a son of God. No, Jesus could have died on the cross to forgive your sins and said, I'm never gonna see you again. Get out of my presence, be a servant. And we would have deserved that 100%. But he forgave, he redeemed, he saved you so that you could be in his presence. You wake this morning. God saved you not just so that you could work for him, but so that you could be with him. And the whole point from Genesis to Revelation, in Genesis chapter 2, the Bible uses this metaphor of God walking with Adam and Eve in the cool of the day. Presence. God's presence intimately among them. God is tangible. It's like he's walking through the garden with them. And then what happens when sin enters into the creation, Genesis 3:8 says the most fascinating thing. It says after Adam and Eve sinned, that they hid themselves from the presence of the Lord. The effect of sin is that we hide from the presence of the Lord. And then you fast forward all the way to Revelation chapter 21, the climax of all of human history, the climax of this story that weaves in and out through all the pitfalls and all the betrayals and all the sin and all the brokenness from Genesis to Revelation. It's leading somewhere, and it's that a city will come down from heaven, and here's what it says, God will be with them. They will be his people and he will be their God. Presence. From Genesis to Revelation, it's about God's presence. And all throughout the Old Testament, we see that because of sin, God keeps providing these ways for the Israelites to access his presence. They keep rebelling, they keep sinning, and God keeps providing a way. In Exodus 33, where we're gonna read this morning, Moses meets with God in what the Bible calls the tent of meeting. Just this little tent outside of the camp. And Moses just goes in there, and the presence of God, it says, descends like a cloud. Meets with Moses. Moses comes out, his face is radiant. So there's a tent of meeting. Then later on, they build the temple. You remember the temple of Solomon, and God meets with his people. And then right in the middle, there's what the Bible talks about as the tabernacle. And basically the tabernacle is just kind of this tent where God provides this specific system of how the Israelites can meet with him, all right? So I'm gonna put a picture on the screen here, and basically here's what you would have. You'd have the tabernacle, and I don't have time to describe in depth every part of the tabernacle, but it's beautiful. There's all sorts of amazing symbolism with it. But in the middle of the tabernacle, there was the most holy place, okay? And in the midst of the most holy place, there was the Ark of the Covenant, okay? And every time you see the Ark in the Old Testament, just think presence. Manifest presence. That's where the manifest presence of God would meet with the people of Israel. God says, I will meet with you between the cherubim. I'll show up in a unique way, right? So God creates this system. And he says, here's how you're gonna gain access to my presence. Because there's a problem. We have the manifest presence of God in the tabernacle, but we also have the problem of sin. That's blocking us in some way from experiencing the presence of God, from experiencing the love of God, from experiencing the mercy of God. That's what's blocking us. And what happens is sin, what does sin lead to? Sin leads to guilt. Because I've sinned, because I've broken God's law, now there's a guilt attached where I know I'm guilty. I know there's something wrong, there's something disordered inside of me. So God provides a system. He says, here's what you need now. You need a priest. And what the priest is gonna have to do is one day a year on the Day of Atonement, the priest is gonna enter the most holy place and he's going to make atonement. Atonement just means bringing you back to a place of oneness. And every year on the Day of Atonement, the priest is gonna sacrifice animals. He's gonna go into the presence of God on behalf of the people and he's gonna make atonement. And so this is part of the story that God's weaving as he's reaching out to his people and he's saying, I want you to be in my presence, but there's a way that it has to happen. So we're gonna revisit this. Just keep this in the back of your mind. But we're gonna go to Exodus 33, right now. And just to give you some background, Exodus 32 is the story of the golden calf. So not a high point in the history of Israel, right? It's one of my favorite stories because Moses goes up on the mountain, comes down. He left Aaron in charge. You leave your oldest to babysit the younger kids, and you come home and it's, oh, what happened? So Moses comes down and they're all worshiping a golden calf. And Moses comes to Aaron, he's like, bro, what happened? And Aaron's like, 1 second, there was nothing. And then the next second, a golden calf just jumped out of the fire. Like Moses is like, you actually expect me to believe that? Right? So the God who delivered the people of Israel, the God who showed up the gods of Egypt in the plagues that he sent, who brought his people out and parted the Red Sea, and a second later they're worshiping an image made of gold. And if that doesn't describe you and I to a T, I don't know what does, right? And so that's where we're picking up is God's not happy with the people of Israel. He's saying, I keep trying to lead you, but you're a stiff-necked and a hard-hearted people. So here's the offer that God puts to the Israelites. Exodus 33, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, leave this place, you and the people you brought up out of Egypt, and go up to the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I will send an angel before you and drive out the Canaanites, Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, Cellulite. No, that's not in there. I wish, that'd be cool. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go with you. Translation, my presence will not go with you because you are a stiff-necked people and I might destroy you on the way. Verse 4, when the people heard these distressing words, they began to mourn and no one put on any ornaments. Let me give you just the context here. The people of Israel are so rebellious, they're running so far away from God that God gives them an offer. He says, I'll give you everything you think you want. Remember, they were on their way to Canaan. Canaan just represents like a place of prosperity. It's a land flowing with milk and flowing with honey. It's everything you could ever want. It's the new house, the new boat, the new car, whatever the thing is where you're like, oh, that's the apex of all the stuff that I want in life. And God says, I'll give it to you, but you won't have my presence. I'm gonna send an angel, he'll take you there, but you're not gonna experience my presence anymore. I'm withdrawing my manifest presence from you. And instead of being like, man, what a great deal, what happens? The Israelites begin to mourn. Here's the first point. First point is that God's presence is our joy. Now, you might be saying to yourself, I don't see joy anywhere in this passage, Pastor. This doesn't seem like a joyful moment. Here's what I would argue. I would argue that the things that bring you the most joy are the things that also bring you the most pain if you lose them. So what we see here is when God says, I'm gonna withdraw my presence, you can have all the milk, all the honey, all the prosperity, all that kind of stuff, you can have it, but I'm gonna take my presence away. The Israelites, something just breaks in them and they begin to mourn because they go, what do we have outside of your presence? They're like, what does Canaan even mean? Their joy, they realize their joy wasn't in the promised land. Their joy was in the presence of the God who made the promise. Like the second you realize prosperity without presence is meaningless. All the things you could ever want, all of the promotions, all of the gains, all of the notoriety and the recognition, it's meaningless. And you can get to the top and you can get all the way to the promised land that you've been searching for all the way and realize that God wasn't in it. And you know what? You're gonna mourn just like the Israelites. You're gonna say, there was no joy in it. Canaan means nothing if God's not there. The promised land, whatever it is you think you're searching for, if God's presence isn't there, all you're gonna find is emptiness and brokenness. So God's presence is their joy. Look at Psalm 16:11. Look at what David says. You make known to me the paths of life. You fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. I love the way the NSB says it. In your presence is fullness of joy. Like David understands, in your presence, that's where I find my joy. And if it's true that in his presence is fullness of joy, the opposite must also be true. That outside of his presence, all we have is disappointment and brokenness and sorrow. Because our joy is in his presence. Let's keep reading. I'm gonna skip ahead a few verses. I can't read verses 7 and following for time, but that's where Moses speaks with God in the tent of meeting. And then here's what God says. Verse 14, the Lord replied, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. Then Moses says to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not send us up from here. How will anyone know that you are pleased with me and with your people unless you go with us? And then catch this. What else will distinguish me and your people from all the other people on the face of the earth? So here's the second point. God's presence is our identity. God's presence is our identity. Because here's what Moses is saying. He's saying, well, how will we have any kind of identity as your people if your presence isn't with us? If you're not here, we're not any different from all the other ites that were just mentioned a couple verses earlier. There's nothing that distinguishes us. What else will distinguish me and your people from all other peoples on the face of the earth? So that begs the question, what makes church different? If we're the people of God, what makes this place any different from any other place you could go? And I would just contend with you that if we do not encounter God's presence as a church, in our gatherings, in our meetings, if that's not the reason why we come, then we're basically just a mediocre concert and a subpar TED Talk about spirituality. All of the talent and the programs and the giftedness of human beings means nothing. It stands for nothing if when we come into this room, God is not here. And what Moses says, basically, he says, if your presence doesn't go with us, God, just let us die out here in the desert. Because all we're left with is just this empty shell. And how many times have we been to church and it wasn't about God's presence and it was just about a good message and a couple of songs and try to live a better life, and that's so empty. There's so much more when you realize that as a community, when we come, what marks us out is that we worship God, and as we worship God, His presence actually meets with us. The very God that we serve, the very God that we worship is not distant. He's closer than the air that we breathe. When we realize that, we find our identity. That's who I am. I was made for this. All of a sudden it surges back up. Man, it's so good to be home. I was made for this. This is where I belong. Look at look at what Charles Finney says. He says this: if the presence of God is in the church will draw the world in. If the presence of God is not in the church world will draw the church out. I sincerely hope that when God attracts people to this church, that it's not because Pastor Joey is gifted or the worship team is gifted or we have good programs. Because let me just tell you, if I could just let you in vulnerably here, that's way more weight than myself or Pastor Joey or anybody could ever bear. To think that the reason people are coming is because we're performing well, we have good gifts, we're good communicators. That can last for a second, but then if the worship isn't as good this week, if the message isn't hitting on all cylinders, people will go somewhere else. But if we came to encounter the presence of God, then it doesn't matter how broken we are, and it doesn't matter how many times we screw up the message or we hit the wrong chord in worship. That's not why we came in the first place. That's not what distinguishes us. What distinguishes us is the presence of God. Acts 4:13, look at this. You remember Peter, right? Peter, the guy that has quite a bit of trouble in the Gospels, constantly getting himself into a mess. That Peter encounters the presence of God in Acts 2. And all of a sudden, he and John just start going on a rampage around town, preaching the gospel fearlessly, testifying to Jesus, healing the sick. They just go up to a crippled guy and they're like, oh, you're crippled? Get up. The guy's like, okay, just gets up, right? Like these guys they're just on a tear, right? And then when the Jewish leaders see this, look at what they say. When they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished and they took note that these men had been with Jesus. What distinguished them? They had been with Jesus. They had been in the presence of God. When these guys get around, when people see the example of your life, it doesn't matter how smart you are, how wealthy you are, how qualified you might feel or you don't feel. Peter and John, according to this verse, are unschooled, ordinary, untrained, don't have any qualifications, don't have any letters next to their name. And there's something beautiful when people see the example of your life as you walk in the way of Jesus, that literally as people observe your faithfulness to Jesus, they go, that has to be God. I knew that guy in high school, that has to be God. I taught that kid in elementary school, that has to be God. Like there's something beautiful because it's the presence of God. And in that moment, you get to testify to you say, yeah, it's not me. It's not my training. It's not anything I've ever learned. You wanna know what happened? I've been with Jesus. That's where my identity is. Gifting and talent will always fade. It will always crumble. But the presence of God will always shine out as the beacon that identifies the people of God. What makes the people of God is the presence of God. That's what makes us different. That's where our identity is. Here's the last thing. God's presence is our rest. Rewind just a second to the beginning of verse 14. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. God's presence is where you can truly find rest. But if this statement is true, then the opposite must also be true. It must also be true that outside of the presence of God, you will live a restless and anxious life. Until you find out that this is the place where your true rest is, you will instantly run around trying to define your own purpose, trying to define who you are for yourself. And listen, that's exhausting. It breaks my heart that kids are being taught in their families, in their schools, you make your own identity. That's up to you. You define who you are. You define what your life is going to be about. You define everything about yourself. Nobody else can speak into that. No religion, no faith, no God, nothing. You make you. And you're like, this kid's 6 years old. He can't even pick what he wants on the menu. And we place the crushing weight of telling people that they have to define their own identity. What does that lead to? Restlessness, anxiety. Because you were never called to make your own self, to form your own self, to make your own image, to make your own identity. You were always meant to find rest in the presence of God. In the presence of God, you hear that whisper of the Father telling you, this is who you are. This is who you are, not that. And you let go of the crippling weight of self-definition, and you take upon yourself the rest of God forming your identity in his presence. Look at Psalm 84. The psalmist says, how lovely is your dwelling place. How lovely is your dwelling place, Lord Almighty. Listen to the language here. My soul yearns, even faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh cry out for the living God. Even the sparrow has found a home, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may have her young, a place near your altar, Lord Almighty, my King and my God. Blessed are those who dwell in your house. They're ever praising you. You hear the longing in the heart of the psalmist. My heart and flesh, something deep inside of me cries out to be in the courts of the Lord, to be in the presence of the Lord. And then he says, in the presence of the Lord, it's like the sparrow even has a home. The swallow even is making her nest in there. Why? Because everybody longs to go home. Everybody longs to find that place of rest. Everybody longs to be able to lay back, to not have to struggle anymore, to not have to feel like you have to defend yourself and justify yourself and validate yourself. At the end of the day, everybody wants to lay all of that down and then want to find a home next to the altar and then want to dwell in the house of the Lord. That's the deepest longing of your heart. You might not even know it, but that's the deepest longing of your heart. We find rest in God's presence because we find our home in God's presence. So what does it look like to be presence people? I think it looks a lot like my dad and I after that freezing cold football game. When we walked through the doors and we felt that warm air, we took off our soggy socks and our soaking shoes, and we sat down and said, it's so good to be home. And that's our desire for you, that in this community, when you come, not because people are gifted and talented and good at their jobs, but when you encounter the presence of God, when you walk in and week out, that would be what triggers that response. It's so good to be home. This is where I belong. I'm a presence person. I'm a presence person. I belong in his presence. This is who I am. This is my home. People are knocking stuff down in the back. I bet somebody just got slain in the spirit back there. I'm not even done speaking yet. There's one more question though that I want to answer, and then I want us to go into worship and respond, okay? How do we get home? Because if we want to live in the presence of God, if that's our home, how do we get back home? Because I told you, we all start far from home. We've all hid from the presence of God. We've hid our faults and we've hid our shortcomings and we've hid from the Lord and we've fabricated those fig leaves to try to hide who we are from God. How do we get back home? Well, let me flash you back to what we were talking about with the tabernacle, okay? I want to show you something cool. I want to show you how we get home. And remember, the ark, the manifest presence of God, was in the middle of the tabernacle. And in Numbers chapter 2, God instructs the people of God to camp around the presence of God. To camp around the tabernacle, around the ark, and they were all to camp facing the ark. And let me show you what this looked like. If you were to fly a drone over the top, if you were to look at a 30,000 foot view, here's what you'd see. You'd see the ark in the middle, the tabernacle in the middle. Then on the west, you'd see the tribe of Judah. Then on the east, God tells Ephraim, I want you to camp on the east side. And then to the north, God tells the tribe of Dan, I want you to camp to the north, facing the presence of God. Then finally, he tells Reuben, I want you to camp to the south. If you were to fly over their camp, this is what you would have seen. It was never about arks and tents and animals and sacrifices. Even in the midst of the people of Israel's hard hearts and rebellion, God already had a plan. It was always about the cross. We gain access to the presence of God through the cross. To be presence people, first and foremost, means that we're Jesus people. And we see the sacrifice that Jesus made on our behalf to redeem us, to bring us into the presence of God. It's all about the cross. Why don't you stand this morning? I want us to respond. Because, you see, we saw the problem of sin and the problem of guilt. And we needed a priest. And we needed atonement. And that's what Jesus came and did on our behalf. I just want to circle this all around. This is not about chasing some ethereal thing and looking for goosebumps. It's about Jesus. We enter the presence of God because Jesus did his work perfectly on our behalf so that we can be presence people. And so what I want to do, as the lights go down, as the band begins to play, I want to actually have you respond. I left time specifically at the end here so that we could respond to the presence of the Lord in this place. And I don't normally do this. It might ruffle some people's feathers, which is totally okay. But we've got brand new comfortable carpet. And there's a big open spot of it up here at the front. And so as the band begins to sing and play, I just want to invite you, if you feel the Lord leading you, why don't you just come kneel up here at the front and begin to just pray that prayer of Psalm 84. Lord, my heart and my flesh, everything in me longs for your presence. And I believe the manifest presence of God is about to fill this place in such a powerful way that you're gonna be able to deal with trauma from your past, that you're gonna be able to deal with the wounds of betrayal, that you're gonna be able to deal with the pain of disappointment and shattered promises and all of those kinds of things. All of that withers away when God is in the room. And so even now, as I pray, at any given moment, I just want to say this is open. The prayer team's going to be back by the banner. If you want somebody to specifically pray for you, that's fine. But if not, come up here and just get low and just recognize your spot in the presence of the Lord, which is to get low and to worship. So Father, we thank you for your presence. Holy Spirit, come. We thank you for the gift of being in your presence, the gift of just being with you. All the lengths that you went to bring us to your presence. We honor you, Jesus. And we say there is nothing else on this earth that can satisfy us. Only you, only your presence. Oh God, would this house not be built on the talent of individuals? Would you break down the marketing and the pride? God, that it wouldn't be about our brand, that it wouldn't be about our label, that it wouldn't be about our ministries, but it would be about your presence. That it would be about your presence, the habitation of your presence in this house. So God, would you move on hearts right now? The Lord's touching hearts. He's touching right now. You feel the Lord moving on you. The second you feel him touching you in that way, just come, just find your way at the front. If we have staff or elders, if you guys could pray for some of the people up here. Let's sing, let's worship. Come on, just enter in, press in right now.